Chapter 7. Stepan Arkadyevitch had gone to Petersburg to perform the most natural and essential official duty, so familiar to everyone in the government service, though incomprehensible to outsiders. That duty, but for which one could hardly be in government service, of reminding the ministry of his existence, and having, for the due performance of this rite, taken all the available cash from home, and was gaily and agreeably spending his days at the races and in the summer villas. Meanwhile, Dolly and the children had moved into the country to cut down expenses as much as possible. She had gone to Ergoshovo, the estate that had been her dowry, and the one where in spring the forest had been sold. It was nearly 40 miles from Levin's estate. The big old house at Ergoshovo had been pulled down long ago, and the old prince had had the lodge done up and built on it. 20 years before, when Dolly was a child, the lodge had been roomy and comfortable, though, like all lodges, it stood sideways to the entrance avenue and faced the south. But by now this lodge was old and dilapidated. When Stepan Arkadyevitch had gone down in the spring to sell the forest, Dolly had begged him to look over the house and order what repairs might be needed. Stepan Arkadyevitch, like all unfaithful husbands indeed, was very solicitous for his wife's comfort, and he himself had looked over the house and given instructions about everything that he considered necessary. What he considered necessary was to cover all the furniture, to put up curtains, to weed the garden, to make a little bridge on the pond, and to plant flowers. But he forgot many other essential matters, the want of which greatly distressed Darya Alexandrovna later on. In spite of Stepan Arkadyevitch's efforts to be an attentive father and husband, he never could keep in mind that he had a wife and children. He had bachelor tastes, and it was in accordance with them that he shaped his life. On his return to Moscow, he informed his wife with pride that everything was ready, and the house would be a little paradise, and that he advised her most certainly to go. His wife staying away in the country was very agreeable to Stepan Arkadyevitch from every point of view. It did the children good, it decreased expenses, and it left him more at liberty. Darya Alexandrovna regarded staying in the country in the summer as essential for the children, especially for the little girl who had not succeeded in regaining her strength after the scarlatina, and also as a means of escaping from petty humiliations, the little bills owing to the wood merchant, the fishmonger, and the shoemaker, which made her miserable. Besides this, she was pleased to go away to the country because she was dreaming of getting her sister to stay with her there. Kitty was to be back from abroad in the middle of the summer, and bathing had been prescribed for her. Kitty wrote that no prospect was so alluring as to spend the summer with Dolly at Ergoshovo, full of childish associations for both of them. The first days of her existence in the country were very hard for Dolly. She used to stay in the country as a child, and the impression she had retained of it was that the country was a refuge from all unpleasantness of town, that life there, though not luxurious, Dolly could easily make up her mind to that, was, however, cheap and comfortable, that there was plenty of everything. Everything was cheap, everything could be got, and children were happy. But now, coming to the country as the head of a family, she perceived that it was utterly unlike what she had fancied. The day after their arrival there was a heavy fall of rain, and in the night the water came in through the corridor and in the nursery, so that the beds had to be carried into the drawing-room. There was no kitchen maid to be found. Of the 9 cows, it appeared from the words of the cowherd woman that some were about to calve, others had just calved, others were old, and others again hard-uddered. There was not butter nor milk enough even for the children. There were no eggs. They could get no fowls, and old purplish stringy roosters were all they had for roasting and boiling. Impossible to get women to scrub the floors. all were busy hoeing potatoes. Driving was out of the question, because one of the horses was restive and bolted in the shafts. There was no place where they could bathe. The whole of the river bank was trampled by the cattle and open to the road. Even walks were impossible, for the cattle strayed into the garden through a gap in the hedge, and there was one terrible bull who bellowed, and therefore might be expected to gore somebody. There were no proper cupboards for their clothes. What cupboards there were either would not close at all, or burst open whenever anyone passed by them. There were no pots and pans. There was no copper in the wash-house, nor even an ironing board in the maid's room. Finding, instead of peace and rest, all these, from her point of view, fearful calamities, Darya Alexandrovna was at first in despair. She exerted herself to the utmost, felt the hopelessness of the position, and was every instant suppressing the tears that started into her eyes. The bailiff, a retired quartermaster, whom Stepan Arkadyevna had taken a fancy to and had appointed bailiff on account of his handsome and respectful appearance as a hall porter, showed no sympathy for Darya Alexandrovna's woes. He said respectfully, "Nothing can be done. The peasants are such a wretched lot," and did nothing to help her. The position seemed hopeless. But in the Oblonskys' household, as in all families indeed, there was one inconspicuous but most valuable and useful person, Marya Philimonovna. She soothed her mistress, assured her that everything would come round, it was her expression, and Matvey had borrowed it from her, and without fuss or hurry proceeded to set to work herself. She had immediately made friends with the bailiff's wife, and on the very first day she drank tea with her and the bailiff under the acacias, and reviewed all the circumstances of the position. Very soon Marya had established her club, so to say, under the trees, and there it was in that club, consisting of the bailiff's wife, the village elder, and the counting-house clerk, that the difficulties of existence were gradually smoothed away. And in a week's time everything actually had come round. The roof was mended, a kitchen maid was found, a crony of the village elders. Hens were bought, the cows began giving milk, the garden hedge was stopped up with stakes, the carpenter made a mangle, hooks were put in the cupboards, and they ceased to burst open spontaneously. And an ironing board covered with army cloth was placed across the arm of a chair in the chest of drawers, and there was a smell of flat irons in the maid's room. "Just see now, and you were quite in despair," said Marya, pointing to the ironing board. They even rigged up a bathing shed of straw hurdles. Lily began to bathe, and Darya Alexandrovna began to realize, if only in part, her expectations, if not of a peaceful, at least of a comfortable life in the country. Peaceful with 6 children, Darya Alexandrovna could not be. One would fall ill, another might easily become so, a third would be without something necessary, a fourth would show symptoms of a bad disposition, and so on. Rare indeed were the brief periods of peace. But these cares and anxieties were for Darya Alexandrovna the sole happiness possible. Had it not been for them, she would have been left alone to brood over the husband who did not love her. And besides, hard though it was for the mother to bear the dread of illness, the illnesses themselves, and the grief of seeing signs of evil propensities in her children, the children themselves were even now repaying her in small joys for her suffering. Those joys were so small that they passed unnoticed, like gold in sand, and at bad moments she could see nothing but the pain, nothing but the sand. But there were good moments, too, when she saw nothing but the joy, nothing but good. Now, in the solitude of the country, she began to be more and more frequently aware of those joys. Often, looking at them, she would make every possible effort to persuade herself that she was mistaken, that she as a mother was partial to her children. All the same, She could not help saying to herself that she had charming children, all 6 of them in different ways, but a set of children such as is not often to be met with, and she was happy in them and proud of them. Chapter 8. Towards the end of May, when everything had been more or less smoothed over, she received her husband's answers to her complaints of the disorganized state of things in the country. He wrote begging her forgiveness for not having thought of everything before, and promised to come down at the first chance. This chance did not present itself. Until the beginning of June, Darya Alexandrovna stayed alone in the country. On the Sunday in St. Peter's week, Darya Alexandrovna drove to Mass for all her children to take the sacrament. Darya Alexandrovna, in her intimate philosophical talks with her sister, her mother, and her friends, very often astonished them by the freedom of her views in regard to religion. She had a strange religion of transmigration of souls, all her own, in which she had firm faith, troubling herself little about the dogmas of the Church. But in her family she was strict in carrying out all that was required by the Church, and not merely in order to set an example, but with all her heart in it. The fact that the children had not been at sacrament for nearly a year worried her extremely, and with the full approval and sympathy of Marya Philimonovna, she decided that this should take place now in the summer. For several days before, Darya Alexandrovna was busy deliberating on how to dress all the children. Frocks were made or altered and washed, seams and flounces were left out, buttons were sewn on, and ribbons gotten ready. One dress, Tanya's, which the English governess had undertaken, cost Darya Alexandrovna much loss of temper. The English governess, in altering it, had made the seams in the wrong place, had taken up the sleeves too much, and altogether spoilt the dress. It was so narrow on Tanya's shoulders that it was quite painful to look at her. But Marya Philimonovna had the happy thought of putting in gussets and adding a little shoulder cape. The dress was set right, but there was nearly a quarrel with the English governess. On the morning, however, all was happily arranged, and towards 10 o'clock, the time at which they had asked the priest to wait for them at Mass, the children in their new dresses, with beaming faces, stood on the step before the carriage, waiting for their mother. To the carriage, instead of the restive raven, they had harnessed, thanks to the representations of Marya Philimonovna, the bailiff's horse, Brownie, and Darya Alexandrovna, delayed by anxiety over her own attire, came out and got in, dressed in a white muslin gown. Darya Alexandrovna had done her hair and dressed with care and excitement. In the old days she had dressed for her own sake to look pretty and be admired. Later on, as she had gotten older, dress became more and more distasteful to her. She saw that she was losing her good looks. But now she began to feel pleasure and interest in dress again. Now she did not dress for her own sake, not for the sake of her own beauty, but simply that as the mother of those exquisite creatures she might not spoil the general effect. And looking at herself for the last time in the looking-glass, she was satisfied with herself. She looked nice. Not nice as she would have wished to look nice in the old days at a ball, but nice for the object which she now had in view. In the church there was no one but the peasants, the servants, and their womenfolk. But Darya Alexandrovna saw, or fancied she saw, the sensation produced by her children and her. The children were not only beautiful to look at in their smart little dresses, but they were charming in the way they behaved. Alyosha, it is true, did not stand quite correctly. He kept turning round, trying to look at his little jacket from behind, but all the same he was wonderfully sweet. Tanya behaved like a little grown-up person and looked after the little ones. And the smallest, Lily, was bewitching in her naive astonishment at everything. On the way home, the children felt that something solemn had happened and were very sedate. Everything went happily at home, too. But at lunch, Grisha began whistling, and what was worse, was disobedient to the English governess, and was forbidden to have any tart. Darya Alexandrovna would not have let things go so far on such a day had she been present, but she had to support the English governess's authority, and she upheld her decision that Grisha should have no tart. This rather spoiled the general good humor. Grisha cried, declaring that Nikolinka had whistled too, and he was not punished, and he wasn't crying for the tart, he didn't care, but at being unjustly treated. This was really too tragic, and Darya Alexandrovna made up her mind to persuade the English governess to forgive Grisha, and she went to speak to her. But on the way, as she passed the drawing-room, she beheld a scene, filling her heart with such pleasure that the tears came into her eyes, and she forgave the delinquent herself. The culprit was sitting at the window in the corner of the drawing-room. Beside him was standing Tanya with a plate. On the pretext of wanting to give some dinner to her dolls, she had asked the governess's permission to take her share of tart to the nursery, and had taken it instead to her brother. While still weeping over the injustice of this punishment, he was eating the tart, and saying through his sobs, Eat yourself. Let's eat it together. Together." Tanya had at first been under the influence of her pity for Grisha, then of a sense of her noble action, and tears were standing in her eyes too, but she did not refuse, and ate her share. On catching sight of their mother, they were dismayed, but looking into her face, they saw they were not doing wrong. They burst out laughing, and with their mouths full of tart, they began wiping their smiling lips with their hands and smearing their radiant faces all over with tears and jam. "Oh, mercy, your new white frock, Tanya, Grisha," said their mother, trying to save the frock, but with tears in her eyes, smiling a blissful, rapturous smile. The new frocks were taken off, and orders were given for the little girls to have their blouses put on, and the boys their old jackets, and the wagonette to be harnessed, with Brownie, to the bailiff's annoyance, again in the shafts, to drive out for mushroom picking and bathing. A roar of delighted shrieks arose in the nursery, and never ceased till they had set off for the bathing place. They gathered a whole basketful of mushrooms. Even Lily found a mushroom. It had always happened before that Miss Hoole had found them and pointed them out to her, but this time she found quite a big one herself, and there was a general scream of delight. "Lily has found a mushroom!" Then they reached the river and put the horses under the birch trees and went to the bathing place. The coachman fastened the horses, who kept whisking away the flies, to a tree, and treading down the grass, lay down in the shade of a birch and smoked his shag, while the never-ceasing shrieks of delight of the children floated across to him from the bathing place. Though it was hard work to look after all the children and restrain their wild pranks, though it was difficult, too, to keep in one's head and not mix all the stockings, little breeches and shoes for the different legs, and to undo and do up again all the tapes and buttons, Darya Alexandrovna, who had always liked bathing herself and believed it to be very good for the children, enjoyed nothing so much as bathing with all the children. To go over all those fat little legs, pulling on their stockings, to take in her arms and dip those little bodies and hear their screams of delight, to see the breathless faces, with wide-open, scared and happy eyes, of all her splashing cherubs, was a great pleasure to her. When half the children had been dressed, some peasant women in holiday dress, out picking herbs, came up to the bathing shed and stopped shyly. Marya Filimonovna called one of them and handed her a sheet and a shirt that had dropped into the water for her to dry them, and Darya Alexandrovna began to talk to the women. At first they laughed behind their hands and did not understand her questions, but soon they grew bolder and began to talk, winning Darya Alexandrovna's heart at once by the genuine admiration of the children that they showed. "My, what a beauty!" said one, admiring Tanichka and shaking her head. "But then—" "Yes, she has been ill." "And so they've been bathing you too," said another to the baby. "No, he's only 3 months old," answered Darya Alexandrovna with pride. "You don't say so." "And have you any children?" "I've had 4. I've 2 living, a boy and a girl. I weaned her last carnival." "How old is she?" "Why, she's 2 years old." "Why did you nurse her so long?" "It's our custom, for 3 fasts." And the conversation became most interesting to Darya Alexandrovna. What sort of time did she have? What was the matter with the boy? Where was her husband? Did it often happen? Darya Alexandrovna felt disinclined to leave the peasant women. So interesting to her was their conversation, so completely identical were all their interests. What pleased her most of all was that she clearly saw what the women admired more than anything was her having so many children, and such fine ones. The peasant women even made Darya Alexandrovna laugh, and offended the English governess, because she was the cause of the laughter she did not understand. One of the younger women kept staring at the Englishwoman, who was dressing after all the rest, and when she put on her 3rd petticoat she could not refrain from the remark, "My, she just keeps putting on and putting on. She'll never be done," she said. And they all went off into roars of laughter. Chapter 9. On the drive home, as Darya Alexandrovna, with all her children round her, their heads still wet from the bath, and a kerchief tied over her own heads, was getting near the house, the coachman said, "There's some gentleman coming, the master of Pokovskro, or so I believe." Darya Alexandrovna peeped out in front, and was delighted when she recognized in the gray hat and gray coat the familiar figure of Levin walking to meet them. She was glad to see him at any time, but at this moment she was especially glad that he should see her in all her glory. No one was better able to appreciate her grandeur than Levin. Seeing her, he found himself face to face with one of the pictures of his daydream of family life. "You're like a hen with your little chicks, Darya Alexandrovna." "Ah, how glad I am to see you," she said, holding out her hand to him. "Glad to see me, but you didn't let me know. My brother's staying with me. I got a note from Stiva that you were here." "From Stiva?" Darya Alexandrovna asked with surprise. "Yes, he writes that you are here, and that he thinks you might allow me to be of use to you," said Levin, and as he said it, he became suddenly embarrassed, and stopping abruptly, he walked on in silence by the wagonette, snapping off the buds of the lime trees and nibbling them. He was embarrassed through a sense that Darya Alexandrovna would be annoyed by receiving from an outsider help that should come by rights by her own husband. Darya Alexandrovna certainly did not like this little way of Stepan Arkadyevitch's of foisting his domestic duties on others, and she was at once aware that Levin was aware of this. It was just for this fineness of perception, for this delicacy, that Darya Alexandrovna liked Levin. "I know, of course," said Levin, that simply means you would like to see me, and I'm exceedingly glad. Though I can fancy that, used to town housekeeping as you are, you must feel in the wilds here, and if there's anything wanted, I'm altogether at your disposal." "Oh, no," said Dolly. "At first things were rather uncomfortable, but now we've settled everything capitally. Thanks to my nurse, she said, indicating Marya Philimonovna, who, seeing that they were speaking of her, smiled brightly and cordially to Levin. She knew him and knew that he would be a good match for her young lady, and was very keen to see the matter settled. "Won't you get in, sir? We'll make room on this side," she said to him. "No, I'll walk. Children, who'd like to race the horses with me?" The children knew Levin very little, and could not remember when they had seen him, but they experienced, in regard to him, none of that strange feeling of shyness and hostility which children so often experience towards hypocritical grown-up people, and for which they are so often and miserably punished. Hypocrisy in anything whatever may deceive the cleverest and most penetrating man, but the least wide-awake of children recognizes it and is revolted by it, however ingeniously it may be disguised. Whatever faults Levin had, there was not a trace of hypocrisy in him, and so the children showed him the same friendliness that they saw in their mother's face. On his invitation, the two elder ones at once jumped out to him, and ran with him as simply as they would have done with their nurse or Miss Hoole or their mother. Lily, too, began begging to go with him, and her mother handed her to him, and he sat her on his shoulder and ran along with her. Don't be afraid, Darya Alexandrovna," he said, smiling good-humoredly at the mother. "There's no chance of my hurting or dropping her." And looking at his strong, agile, assiduously careful, and needlessly wary movements, the mother felt her mind at rest, and smiled gaily and approvingly as she watched him, here in the country, with children, and with Darya Alexandrovna, with whom he was in sympathy. Levin was in a mood not infrequent with him, of childlike light-heartedness that she particularly liked in him. As he ran with the children, he taught them gymnastic feats, set Miss Hoole laughing with his odd English accent, and talked to Darya Alexandrovna of his pursuits in the country. After dinner, Darya Alexandrovna, sitting alone with him on the balcony, began to speak of Kitty. "You know, Kitty's coming here, and she's going to spend the summer with me." "Really?" he said, flushing, and at once, to change the conversation, he said, "Then I'll send you 2 cows, shall I? If you insist on a bill, you shall have to pay me 5 rubles a month, but it's really too bad of you." "Oh, no, thank you. We can manage very well now." "Oh, well then, I'll have a look at your cows, and if you'll allow me, I'll give directions about their food. Everything depends on their food." And Levin, to turn the conversation, explained to Darya Alexandrovna the theory of cow-keeping, based on the principle that the cow is simply a machine for the transformation of food into milk, and so on. He talked of this, and passionately longed to hear more of Kitty, and at the same time was afraid of hearing it. He dreaded the breaking up of the inward peace he had gained with such effort. "Yes, but still, all this has to be looked after, and who is there to look after it?" Darya Alexandrovna responded without interest. She had by now got her household matters so satisfactorily arranged, thanks to Marya Philimonovna, that she was disinclined to make any change in them. Besides, she had no faith in Levin's knowledge of farming. General principles, as to the cow being a machine for the production of milk, she looked on with suspicion. It seemed to her that such principles could only be a hindrance in farm management. It all seemed to her a far simpler matter. All that was needed, as Marya Philimonovna had explained, was to give Brindle and Whitebreast more food and drink, and not to let the cook carry all the kitchen slops to the laundry-maid's cow. That was clear. But general propositions as to feeding on meal and grass were doubtful and obscure. And, what was most important, she wanted to talk about Kitty.